It is my pleasure to interview George Anastasia today. George is an American author and was a longtime writer for the Philadelphia Inquirer. He is widely considered to be an expert on the American Mafia. He was an organized crime investigative reporter who was once targeted for death by then Philadelphia crime family boss John Stanfa. He has twice been nominated for the Pulitzer Prize and has won the Sigma Delta Chi Award. He was also been described on a 60 Minutes television profile as one of the most respected crime reporters in the country. Doctor, a little bit about yourself before we get into George.
So I grew up outside of Philadelphia and
Suburb?
Lower Merion suburbs.
Yeah.
And then after medical school in Philadelphia, I moved to Detroit.
Are you representing Detroit today then?
I'm representing Detroit. Got to show my support for the Tigers now that the Phillies are out.
Are you a Detroit Lions fan? Football fan?
When it comes to sports and being a fan for Philadelphia and a fan for Detroit, Detroit needs all the love that they can get when it came to sports 5 years ago. The Lions weren't great. The Tigers weren't great. You could easily get tickets to any game that you wanted. And 5 years later, as I was transitioning, coming back to Philadelphia, both teams were in the playoffs. So I have love for Detroit.
What is your field of practice?
I'm a practicing ophthalmologist. I specialize in anterior segment surgery, cataract and glaucoma surgery. So I spend most of my time with older individuals. That's my specialty.
I would qualify that. As an older individual. Maybe some eye treatment, some stuff you can pump into my under here.
I'd be happy to.
You do that?
Aside from the medical part and the surgical part, it's about spending time with patients and getting to know people. That's the best part about medicine for me.
It's interesting. The last time we were together with George Anastasia, we were at the Villa de Roma.
Absolutely.
And you were, again, a part of that whole thing. So I'm curious, is there like an alter ego for like mob people, mob guys?
Well, I would say I'm attracted to a good story. It's always, it's amazing to talk to George Anastasia. He has such a breadth of knowledge about the fabric of what the history of the city, the history of the Mafia. It's such a pleasure to speak with him.
Okay. Do you want to open up with the questions, or you want me to ask? You're the special guest.
Sure. So one question I have is how, and throughout time, I'm sure this has varied, but how the Philadelphia Mafia compares to cities like Boston, Detroit, or Chicago.
I think Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago are all in the shadow of New York. New York is the center of the universe for so many different reasons, but also for organized crime. Chicago is probably, if you're going to rank them, number 2. And Philadelphia and Boston would fit in. Boston covers all of New England, so it's a different kind of situation. But Boston, Philadelphia, Detroit, Cleveland, they're kind of like the AAA of organized crime, whereas New York and Chicago are the major leagues. But it's still a major dominant player, and the history of Philadelphia, the story of Philadelphia is a fascinating story, always has been.
Are the areas of crime that you see in each city similar, or are there distinct avenues, like because of ports in some city?
Well, I think geography plays a part in it, but at the end of the day, the bottom line for organized crime has always been gambling and loan sharking. And whatever else might be available in a given city or particular time. For example, Prohibition created an opportunity, and so everybody was into that. I had a North Jersey mobster tell me one time, well, you have to understand when you're talking about the economics of organized crime, the attitude is vice is commerce. It's not about morality. It's not about is this right, is this wrong. This is a way to make money. So if it's drugs, if it's prostitution, if it's loan sharking, if it's gambling, whatever, it's commerce. That's the way they look at it. It's a story of immigration. If you look at the American history, immigrants have come, and there's always been a small segment of that immigrant population that has become part of the criminal underworld, whether it's Jewish, Irish, Italian, and any ethnic group.
Last time we interviewed you, you said To understand the Mafia, you've got to understand the history of Sicily.
Yeah, I think that's true. I'm not the first person to have said that. A lot of people have said that. I mean, Sicily was an island nation, always dominated by foreigners. If you look at the history of Sicily, the French, the Spanish, the Moors, the Greeks. I mean, I was in Taormina. There's the Greek amphitheater built in the first century. They still use it. It's gorgeous. But Sicily was always a country that was controlled by outsiders. So this whole attitude developed with the general populace that you can't trust authority. They're not. That's not us. The only people you can trust are your family. And I think the Mafia basically evolved out of that. And people say, what was the origins of the Mafia? And I don't think anybody really knows. And if you try to look up the origin of the word Mafia, where did it come from? A mafioso was somebody with a lot of bravado, somebody who was not afraid to be who he was. So I mean that nobody knows for sure, but Sicily was where the Mafia originated, and the whole idea of omerta, the code of silence, is the same principle. You don't go to, if there's a problem, you don't go to the authorities because the authorities are not going to help you. They're not. The only people you go to are your family. So omerta is you don't cooperate with these outsiders. You don't provide any information. If there's a problem, you take care of it yourself. And then the other thing is vendetta. You take care of it in your own time. So I grew up in a town called Westville, in just the other side of the Walt Whitman Bridge. Went to high school in Gloucester Catholic High School, and then went to college, and then I got involved in the newspaper business after college.
Where did you go to college?
I went to Dartmouth, up in New Hampshire.
Did you go there on an academic scholarship?
No, I went up there to play football. I played football for 1 year, and then played rugby after that. But
Really?
yeah, that's when I was.
You were a French major, right?
Yeah, yeah. That's. I'm up in New Hampshire, and it's cold, and it snows in November, and you don't see the ground again until May, maybe. So I did a foreign study. I went to Montpellier. I spent 3 months in Montpellier. And then I go back to Dartmouth, and I say to my advisor, I really like that. I'd like to go again. And he said, well, we only have one program. So the only way you could go back is if you do independent study. And the only way you do independent study is if you major in French. So I said, all right, I'll be a French major. And then I spent another 3 months in Toulouse. And, I think about that now, and a couple things. One, I was the first person in my family to go to college. My mother and father didn't have a clue. And I can't imagine what must have gone through their head when I said I was going to be a French major. What the hell are you going to do with that? But they were great. They said, look, if that's what you want to do, go do it. But while I'm in France the second time, I don't have to go to class. So I'm spending a lot of time in cafes, and I remember every morning I'd buy the cafe au lait and some French bread and butter, and I would buy the International Herald Tribune. Because there was no internet back then. This is back in the 60s. And I would read from cover to cover. And I think that's when I said, it would be interesting to get into the newspaper business. And I used to read Jimmy Breslin's column, and I loved Jimmy Breslin's column. So I think it's one of those things where it's almost serendipity. How do things happen? It happens by happenstance. I think that was becoming a French major led me to being a newspaper guy. And a newspaper guy was a great career to have.
Did you have any mentors that kept you out of organized crime yourself and led you down a path of becoming a writer?
That's his alter ego.
Not
To be a mob guy.
My dad was a great guy. I love him. He's passed away. My dad grew up in the heart of South Philadelphia, and my dad knew guys. And he would say that's not who we are. I mean, my dad was the youngest of 7. His parents came from Sicily. He was the youngest of 7, the only one in his family to graduate from high school. He served in the Marines in World War II, was in the invasions of Guam and Okinawa. Never talked about that, how horrible that was. But, I mean, he always basically instilled in us that, one of the things my dad used to say, and it stays with me, you got to like who you see when you look in the mirror in the morning.
Right.
You can't bullshit that person. They know who you are, and that's what you get. And I think of that every day. I often wonder if my dad, he only went to high school and he knew so much. How did he know so much? So, but I mean, that's where I come from. I mean, one of the things defense attorneys complain about, and rightly so, but they can't do anything about it, is you can't cross-examine a tape.
Mhm.
You can attack a cooperating witness. You were a crook, you're a liar, you're a murderer, you did. But when you've got your own guy, his voice bouncing around off the walls in a courtroom, and we're going to kill this guy and we're going to set him up, and the jury's just sitting there listening, what are you going to do with that? And again and again and again, electronic surveillance has played a dominant role in the prosecution. And these guys don't stop talking. Even though this has happened, some of these guys can't stop talking.
You know, the word vendetta is in our DNA. That was told to me by a priest. I was telling him about what I thought I have of my character flaws,
Yeah.
and I said something about vendetta. He said, "John, it's in your DNA. You have to work that out." You know.
Now, one of the big cases in Philadelphia that John and I did a film about was the case of George Marano. He was really discriminated against based on alleged connections to the mob and his father being a made man. He really got a bad
I mean,
rap.
George got sentenced to life after pleading guilty. That was wrong. It shouldn't have happened. But the spin that he was just a marijuana dealer is not correct either. George was involved in heavy drugs, and he got convicted or pled guilty to being a kingpin. The problem was when you plead guilty, you don't get maxed out, and he got maxed out. I mean, he got life with no parole after pleading guilty. That negates the whole purpose of plea deals. Why plead if you're going to get maxed anyway? Go to trial. That never made sense. People who aren't Italian often don't get. Within Italians, there are subsets. Where are you from? I'm from Sicily. I'm from Naples. I'm from Calabria. There's a real distinction, and people recognize that, and people have stereotypes. So you're a Sicilian. You're a Calabrese. You must be hard-headed. You're a Sicilian. You must be greedy. You're a Napolitan. You got a lot of bravado. I mean, all of that figures into the evolution of organized crime, and all of that's part of the story. The boss is the guy in charge. The underboss is kind of the guy who takes the policies and makes them happen. And the consigliere is the counselor, the guy you go to if there are disputes. Consigliere is usually an older veteran, a guy who's been around. And then underneath that is the capos, the capodicini, the boss, and then under them are the soldiers, and then the associates.
You brought up the rank of the mafia, but you didn't say where in that line the driver is.
The driver. Sometimes look when
Is
Paul,
the driver equivalent to an underboss?
when Paul Castellano was boss in New York, his driver was a guy named Tommy Bellotti. He was the underboss. But with Bruno, no. The underboss was always somebody. Well, at that particular time, he had an underboss who was based in Newark. So the driver was just a close associate. And in this particular instance, Long John Marano wasn't even a made guy, but he was a top associate of Bruno's. And they were big money makers.
Before we talk about the mob
Yeah.
books, let me ask you about Summer Wind,
Oh, yeah.
because that's I actually, when we advertised this, I got some people interested in want to know about Summer Wind. It's Tom Capano and Anne Marie Fay.
I talked to members of the Fay family, and God love them. I mean, they were smart enough to realize the suspect in this case is a major mover and shaker in Wilmington politics, Tom Capano. And the only way we can keep this case alive is by making ourselves accessible to the media. And they were great. The brothers, they talked to me, and I was able to do a takeout on the status of this investigation. But
This was before he was arrested.
yeah, this is before he's arrested, so nobody knows what's going to happen. But everybody suspected him. There was circumstantial evidence, but nothing solid. And I remember I'm periodically bouncing in and out of Delaware to stay on top of it. And then this news breaks that one of the brothers had come forward and given up the story because they were putting pressure on Capano's two brothers. And one brother was in the horrific story about the burial at sea. And so the brother, Jerry Capano, is cooperating, and he tells law enforcement this story about how his brother Tom had him drive Anne Marie Fay's body down to Stone Harbor, New Jersey, in an ice chest, an igloo ice chest. They took it out on his boat, Jerry's boat, which was called the Summer Wind, like that great Sinatra song. They took the boat, they drove 60 miles out to where Jerry used to go out, to called Mayco Alley, where he used to fish for shark. and they threw the cooler in the water. And it doesn't sink. Jerry's telling the cops the story when this how they make the arrest. And it doesn't sink. And so Jerry gets a shotgun that he has on board and he shoots a hole into the cooler where Faye's body is. And some blood comes out, but it still doesn't sink. Now they pull the cooler back onto the boat, rip the lid off, take the body out, wrap it in a couple anchors, throw the body. Now Jerry's saying he's up front and Tom's doing all this. He turns around and he looks, and what he sees is an ankle wrapped in a chain disappearing into the water. That's the last he sees. Now they wash the cooler out and they throw it in the ocean. So this is the story when the arrest happens. Now they finally made an arrest. And I remember talking to a police detective and FBI agent that worked the case afterwards. We're talking to them. They said the next day they get a phone call from a guy. He says, I saw the story in the paper about this ice chest, this cooler. Back around that time, I was fishing off, I think, Indian River, Delaware. Me and my son were out there, and this ice chest came floating along. And he said, we scooped it up, and it was brand new. It had a hole in it. We got some epoxy. We patched the hole, and we put our old lid on the new ice chest, and we've been using it to store fish for the past year. You want to take a look at it? So this detective and FBI agent get in a car, and they drive down to this guy's summer home. And they go into, I think he's got it in the garage, and they get this ice chest, and they take it back, and the ice chest still has one of those barcodes on it from when it was purchased. It's one of them things. So they run a check, and Tom Capano used his credit card to buy that ice chest. It was one of those things where you say, if you were writing fiction, people would say that's outlandish. And in that whole entire case, that was the only piece of hard evidence. There was no body, no murder weapon, no definitive cause of death. Yet Tom Capano was convicted of first-degree murder. And I remember the ice chest was the last piece of evidence that they put up in front of the jury. This big ice chest. And they said this was Anne-Marie Faye's coffin. And afterwards I talked to people who said when the jury was deliberating, they had the ice chest and a couple of them tried to climb into it to see it. And Anne-Marie Faye was like 5'10". She would have been squeezed into the section. It was a horrific. I mean, you know, it was a great story, but it was a horrific story. It was a terrible story about Tom Capano, who literally thought he could get away with murder. That he was, and it's funny. We come back, you know, when I was down there working this story because I covered the Mafia, everybody thought, oh, this must be Mafia connected, Capano. But I said, no, it has nothing to do with the Mafia. But in a lot of ways, Tom Capano was more despicable than any mob guy I've ever written about. This was a guy who had it all. And literally because she wanted to break up with him, he decided he was going to kill her. It's horrible.
Let me ask you about it. How did you get to know John Aley? Got his rules.
Yeah.
That's the first time Jill and you and myself met.
John was...
How'd you get to know John? And talk about Gotti.
John contacted me. John had been in the Philadelphia area for a while. When he left New York, he came to Philadelphia, then he went on a run. And he was looking for somebody to write a book about him. And he contacted me, and I had never written anything about New York, and I jumped at the chance to do it. And we hit it off. I mean, he's a fascinating guy as well. And so I talked to him at length, talked to people in law enforcement about his, how valid his story was. And because he testified at a couple trials, and the trial against John Gotti Jr. ended in a hung jury. So you don't have a resolution of that. But, are you going to believe his story or not believe his story? I talked to people who were involved in the case, and they said, yeah, it's a solid story. So at that particular era, with the Marino era, I got to know a lot of those guys. They were not afraid of the media. They wanted the attention. It was really, it wasn't even the Mafia stuff. It wasn't about Omerta, the Code of Silence. This was like South Philly corner boys. You don't want somebody else to get the last word. So they saw me as a vehicle. I mean, they can get their spin on things.
Did anybody ever threaten your life?
John Stanford did. Yeah, John Stanford put a hit out on me.
He did?
Yeah, it's one of the books. The Good Fellow.
We're going to talk about that. All the other books as well.
He did. Stanford was born and raised in Sicily. Came here as an adult. Was a made guy, I think, in the Sicilian Mafia before he came to Philadelphia. And so he had a different mindset. And so I was writing a lot about this. This was the Stanford-Merlino War in the 1990s.
Was that Merlino's father, or this?
No, it
or
was Skinny Joey.
Skinny Joey.
And,
Yeah. Okay.
and so whenever I would have to write a story, I would call up his office. He had the Continental Foods in Grace Ferry. And I would call up and say, "This is Anastasia from the Inquirer. I want to talk to Mr. Stanford about a story I'm writing." And boom, they hang up the phone. And apparently it pissed him off. And he told Sergio Battaglia, "Find out where Anastasia lives, and get some hand grenades and throw them in the window." Now, I don't know any of this, but after Battaglia begins to cooperate, after he's convicted with Stanford, he calls me up from prison. I used to get these collect calls. Whenever I got a collect call from prison, I always took, accept the charges.
Yeah.
Accept the charges. And it's Sergio, and he says, "I want to let you know I'm cooperating, and there's stuff's going to come out about you." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, Stanford told me to get some hand grenades and throw them in your window. He was pissed off at you." And he says to me, "But it was nothing personal." I said, "Sergio, I got a wife and 2 kids. Hand grenades come through the window. It's very personal." He said, "Well, by the time we got the grenades, we were so caught up in the war with Joey Merlino that we stopped looking for you." Yeah, there was times. I mean, I remember sitting down with Joey Merlino for maybe an hour and a half one time on South Street. And when I got done, I'm looking at my notes. He's told me nothing. He was very, very slick that way. He could talk about a lot of different things without saying anything. The nicknames are not a mob thing. The nicknames are a neighborhood thing. I had an uncle, Tony, my Uncle Tony, who worked for a time as a short order cook at a place called Tartax in South Philly. And in the neighborhood, they called him Tony Tartac. His name was Tony Anastasia. But I mean, everybody got a nickname based on whatever.
Yeah,
Wait,
you're
what was
right.
Starfo's nickname?
Little Nicky.
He didn't like that.
He didn't like that. But he was 5'4", I think.
What was his calling card?
Murder.
That was it.
I mean, he was a violent guy, Scarfo. I mean, that's the way he dealt with any
Did
problem.
you talk to him? Did you ever?
No, only no comment, walking out of court, that kind of stuff.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, he was a different generation. They didn't want to talk to the media. The Big Hustle. And it was a story about 1 week at the dawn of casino gambling in Atlantic City. And it's kind of a blue-collar Ocean's 11. There's a mob caper piece. Or, The Sopranos meets Moonstruck, because it's a romantic comedy kind of thing. And the title, The Big Hustle, is there's a scene where a guy's complaining about Atlantic City. See, I was in Atlantic City for the Inquirer when the first 6 casinos opened, so I knew the scene in Atlantic City. It was crazy, wild, and nutso. And I also had gone to Atlantic City my whole life because my grandmother used to have a place down there. And so there's a scene in the book where a guy's complaining about everybody's got a scam going on, everybody's trying to hustle everybody else. Nobody cares about doing the right thing. And he said, if New York is the Big Apple and New Orleans is the Big Easy, you know what this place is? This is the Big Hustle. So that's where the title comes from.
Okay.
It's about Atlantic City. The Inquirer sent me to cover the dawn of casino gambling in Atlantic City, 1978. The referendum, 1976, first casino opened in 1978. And one of the questions back then was, would legalized gaming, and they always called it gaming, not gambling, would legalized gaming bring the mob to Atlantic City? Well, the answer was the mob already was in Atlantic City. So I started covering the mob in the context of the dawn of casino gambling, and then it segued from that to writing more and more about it. And I mean, it's always been, I guess, a topic I was somewhat familiar with. I had a kind of a distorted version of it. I mean, I can remember my mother telling me, and again, this is, two kind of people, Italians and people who want to be.
Oh,
and
boy.
Italians
How many times did I hear that?
Italians are the best at everything.
Oh, she's not Italian, Joe?
Well, she was saying,
no, she's not Italian.
You got Frank Sinatra, you got Mario Lanza, you got Joe DiMaggio, you got Fiorello LaGuardia, you got
Dean
Italians.
Martin.
The Italians are the best at whatever they do. They're even the best crooks. That was my mother's thing. And so, talking about the mafia. So that was growing up. That's all I knew. But as I'm in Atlantic City and I'm seeing what's playing out, this is It's an interesting story. And I got to the point where, as an Italian American, I just said, who better to write about it than an Italian American? Why should somebody else?
Oh, no,
You bring a different perspective to it. And when I would meet with these guys, I think part of the reason I got along was we came from the same place. We knew about the same kind of foods. We all had an uncle
They trusted you.
Yeah, you could have done it. And I would never have that writing about Russian organized crime or Jewish organized crime.
Right. Blood and honor.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that while we have time.
Yeah.
That was 18 minutes.
That was Nick Caramondi. That was the beginning of the end for the Philadelphia mob when Caramondi cooperated. And he was cooperating. He was in protective custody, and he wanted to write a book. And the FBI was going to help him. And he had talked to a couple of writers out in New York, and they didn't connect. And then somebody contacted me through one of our editors, and I went to meet him. And I knew the backstory already, so I didn't have to over-explain. And we just hit it off. And Caramondi's a wonderful storyteller because he was a con man. That's how he existed. So he knows how to tell a story. And he was great. And the book I just let him talk and built his conversations around the events that were taking place from the murder of Bruno right through the Scarfo level.
That was an unauthorized hit, right?
Yeah.
There was no sit down.
There was a
You need to say what that is. Too.
It was a double cross. Tony Bananas Caponegro thought he had
Tony Bananas.
Yeah. He thought he had the approval of the Mafia Commission, and he didn't. He was double crossed by the Genovese crime family, and so he went and carried out the hit, and then he was killed.
How many families were there? Were there 5?
5 families in New York.
And they were the ones that controlled. Did they control the Philadelphia mob too?
Well, no, it was the Mafia Commission, and the Philadelphia mob responded. Everybody supposedly responded to the commission. Bruno, for a while, sat on the commission. There usually were 5 or 9 members, the 5 New York families, and then bosses from 4 or 5 other cities around the country. And Bruno was on the commission. Bruno was a good friend of Carlo Gambino's. So when he got killed, it set things careening out of control. And he was succeeded by Phil Testa, his underboss. And then Testa was killed a year later. And a nail bomb was planted under his. Here's a trivia question. There's only been one mob boss in America ever celebrated in a song by Bruce Springsteen. In the song Atlantic City, there's a line, "They blew up the Chicken Man last night." That's a reference to the Testa.
Right.
So Testa gets killed, and then Scarfo becomes boss. And then Scarfo just runs the organization into the ground with his wanton use of violence.
It's hard to understand a community that's so rooted in honor and loyalty killing another one of its members, its family.
Well, that's the hypocrisy of it. That's they pay lip service to that honor, loyalty, and family, but it's really greed and treachery.
It's greed.
Yeah, that's what it comes down to.
Yeah,
And this Goodfella tapes, they had the bug in the lawyer's office, and every 10 days, the FBI had to file a report with the court. Here's what we're getting. Every 30 days, they had to file a broader report and get reauthorization to keep doing it. And they kept doing it and doing it and doing it over a year and a half. In theory, the way the system is set up, defense attorneys are supposed to do whatever they can legally to defend their client. Prosecutors are supposedly interested in finding the truth. And it doesn't matter if you win or lose. The truth is what matters. But too often it's about winning, not finding the truth. So everybody's cutting corners. It's a flawed system, but it still is the best system that exists. And the goal is to find the truth.
So what's your favorite part of your career? Do you like being a historian? Do you feel that sometimes you're sort of you're getting the truth out of these people? Do you like that you get to talk to the Mafia?
No,
what part of it do you love?
I just like writing stories, and I would say this sometimes. There are a lot of people in this media business that kind of get full of themselves, and at the end of the day, we're not brain surgeons. We're not finding a cure for cancer. And in our best days, what we're going to do is enlighten, inform, and entertain.